we are celebrating the anniversary of the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, and I would like to know from all of you, at the time you were in South Africa, what did Nelson Mandela mean to you?
Under apartheid South Africa, another element of the system was that all the races also went to separate schools. So from K through 12, you went to a school where you only saw people of your own race. There was nobody else. So I went to university in South Africa as well, but I actually went to what was classified as a white university, the University of Natal, which is now University of KwaZulu-Natal. And in that university, it was predominantly white, but there were, of course, a few students of color in the college. And so I grew up, I sort of grew up in the early 80s, and at the university, it was the first time when you actually saw people from a whole lot of other backgrounds and a whole lot of other races. But that doesn't mean to say that when I was in high school, I didn't know what apartheid meant. And I certainly came from a family that was actively opposing it. So when I went into college, Mandela then represented for us just this notion of opposition. He was this figure, this almost mythical figure that we knew had, actively taken on the system, had openly spoken about, the atrocities and so on, and the undersides of racism, and was prepared to engage in battle because of it.
Yeah, I think for me, as Professor Reddy said, one of the cornerstones of apartheid was the education system. And you had a law, that provided education on different levels. So you had, for instance, what was called Bantu education. And basically, that education was, to only let, blacks go to school up until a certain age because they were supposed to be servants. And if they go any further, there won't be that many options for them. And part of that is regardless of, what racial group you were in, all of the textbooks were written and approved by the apartheid government. And so consequently, we learn about our history through whoever was commissioned to write that history in South Africa. And so obviously, in the history we learned in school, it was a history based on the paternalism in South Africa, the supremacy that exists in terms of who was on top and who was at the bottom. And so, so for many of us growing up, Nelson Mandela was a mystery man. We somehow, knew that there was someone somewhere resisting, and that many of the resistant movements have been banned, and so they were either working underground or they were working from outside of the country. But part of growing up, black in South Africa, we had to realize that you have formal education that's in the classroom, and then you have informal education that you learn in the world as your classroom. So we were able to create opportunities, whether it was before or after a soccer game, or even as part of our youth group, we would then, find, resources to educate us about, what our history was really about, and to educate us about, leaders such as, President Nelson Mandela, Steve Biko, Oliver Tambo, and all of the others. And the more we learn about these individuals, for me, Nelson Mandela transitioned then from a mystery man to a man on a mission. And it was then important for us to understand what this mission was, how we connect with it, and how we contribute to it as we move forward. And so that's basically how we, came to know about Nelson Mandela and realizing what that mission was and what our role needed to be, in that particular mission.
I never heard about Nelson Mandela until, the fairly recent past. Because when I was in South Africa, it was 1957, I left there. Apartheid really was promulgated effectively in 1948 and really didn't take hold in probably to the middle 50s. What you need to know, though, is South Africa was always a racist country. Even going back into the 1930s, Jan Smuts, who was supposed to be one of the signatories of the UN Charter, had broken up a strike of black mine workers and killed dozens, hundreds in the 30s, and at the same time removed black South Africans from the common voting roll, so that black South Africans had no voice at all in government in South Africa. So apartheid, although it was effectively de jure in 1948, existed in the country for many, many years prior to that time. So I had no knowledge of Mandela, but I did know about Steve Biko, who kind of preceded Mandela and was a fantastic individual. Unfortunately died much too young.
I'm an immigration attorney. So I'm interested in the legal processes you may or may not have used. Now, I know you won the lottery, Rudolph, but I'm interested in not only the legal process you used to get here, but also what was in general your experience as an immigrant when you came to the United States. Okay?
My name is Rudolph van Raan, and I am the Afrikaner on this panel. I was born in Germiston, in one of the cities close to Johannesburg, and I lived there all my life, and I never imagined that I would be in Los Angeles many years later. In the last 5 years, I've been the pastor of the First Congregational Church of Glendale, which is about 3 miles away from here. It's a UCC church, so I'm very grateful to meet some of my colleagues here and to see them. And I've been so wonderfully accepted and welcomed in America, so thank you very much for that. I became a citizen a year and a half ago, so I'm now a dual citizen. I'm very proud of my American citizenship. Thank you.
When I arrived here, I discovered I was the only South African in Los Angeles, or certainly in UCLA. And one of the things that struck me immediately was I came on my own, and I was picked up at the airport by an acquaintance of my father's partner in Cape Town, who was a screener. And he dropped me off at the fraternity house, which had so kindly agreed to let me stay there while I figured out where I was supposed to go. And I arrived at the fraternity house. It was right after finals. It was in January. And I walked in with my trunk and all my goods. And they said, "Oh, you're the African kid, right?" So I said, "Well, South Africa." "No, it's Africa, South Africa." I had a brother living in Kenya, you know. That was the, Americans didn't understand South Africa at all in the 50s. So I said, yes. So they said, "Well, we got your room ready for you." So they took me upstairs, and I walked into the room, and there, lying on the other bed, was the biggest, blackest guy I'd ever seen in my entire life. He was, Russ Ellis, who was a track star at UCLA. And in those days, I'm not sure what it is true today, the people on scholarship, athletic scholarship, were boarded by various fraternity houses and sororities, I guess, as well. And my immediate reaction was, what is he going to think of me coming from apartheid South Africa living in the same environment. And he didn't understand, he had no clue about the whole concept of apartheid. And we got to be very good friends after quite a bit of time spent together. But it was an interesting introduction to the new world that I came to appear here in Los Angeles.
Good evening. My name is Mavindri Reddy, and I was born in South Africa. I'm part of, I guess, Indians were indentured to South Africa from 1860, and nearly the population is around over 1 million, so 1 million Indians in South Africa, so it goes back a long time. I left, my great-grandparents were the first that came into the country, and so I'm all South African, I think. I left in the mid-1980s, so I also grew up under apartheid, and I went to England for a long time and did my graduate work, and then came here to the US in the mid-1990s. So I've had an experience, I think, of 3 continents. And in all of them, I've had to sort of negotiate my Indianness, because everyone in the US assumes that I must be from India, and everyone in South Africa just assumes that you don't really know India at all. So I've always had to navigate that through life, and I'm looking forward to this conversation tonight.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Calvin Sauls, and I was born on the south side of Johannesburg in a township called Kliptown. And for those who are South Africans will know the significance of Kliptown, because in 1912, that's where the People's Gathering took place, where the Freedom Charter was signed. And the Freedom Charter now is the foundation for the South African Constitution. From there we, after the Group Areas Act was enacted, we were all dispersed out of Kliptown, because it was a very diverse community, like communities like Sophiatown or District 6, in Cape Town. And because of apartheid, those locations were threats, because it showed that people from all racial backgrounds could live together and had a good time. So in Kliptown, we had a variety of racial groups, including Chinese. And so it was a very interesting town, but a very dynamic town. I came to the United States in January of 1990. So this year I'm celebrating my 25th year in South Africa, in the United States. It was a surreal experience for me to sit in the lobby of my dormitory in East Tennessee, Monroe County, the poorest county in Tennessee, where I went to, a very rural area, to watch the release of Nelson Mandela. Very, very surreal, very moving. We couldn't believe it. And because a lot of folks that didn't know what was going on, I was actually glad, because I had the lobby to myself, because I didn't have a TV in my room, so I could at least control the remote that we had and make sure that the channel doesn't get changed. So that was great. But in South Africa, I was very active in the Methodist Church, and through that, entered into resisting apartheid in a variety of ways, because the Methodist Church of Southern Africa was one of the lead denominations resisting apartheid in a variety of ways. And through my work in the youth ministry, was awarded a scholarship by the bishop to come to the United States to study. And I arrived in the United States, leaving in the middle of January, arrived in New York in the middle of winter and didn't know that. So of course I was not dressed appropriately. I landed at JFK in sweatpants and flip-flops. And so you know, when you land there like that, you know, and I was told when you talk to anybody, make sure that you talk with somebody that has uniform on, so they can make sure that they're official, they can give you the right directions. And the first person I ran into was a uniformed African American, and his first words to me were, "I can tell you ain't from here, bro." So that was interesting. And then I landed at Hawassi College in East Tennessee on MLK Day. And that day, they didn't have any classes, and so they had a movie that they showed that night in the student auditorium. And as I walked into the movie, I realized that the movie was Coming to America. So I'm like, wow, this is an interesting welcome to get me here. But I have had the joy of living at the intersection of what I call South Los Angeles and South Johannesburg, as I, on a daily basis, seek to deal with what it means to be in that intersection and how it connects with what's going on currently in South Africa and around the world, and how my experience in South Africa is guiding me now as a pastor in South Los Angeles to see how it is that we can facilitate racial justice, social justice, and economic justice. So looking forward to the conversation, and thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you all. I have one question for each of you, a different question for each of you. Rudolph, could you just say exactly what is an Afrikaner? What is that? I mean, how do you?
That's me.
Yeah. All right. What?
I am an Afrikaner. We, by ancestry, came to southern Africa in 1650. And that was Jan van Riebeeck. He was a Dutchman, and he traveled all the way to Indonesia and the Far East on the spice routes. And the idea was never to establish a colony in Africa. It was simply just an aid station for the ships that would go around Africa to the Far East on the spice route. Now, I always see a lot of similarity between that history and also the history of colonizing of this continent, Northern Africa, Northern America. It was almost at the same time that these people left Europe, and we always say, well, 10 boats or 9 boats came here, but 1 boat went down to Africa. So, you know, my ancestors were just on the boat that went to Africa. The first 50 years were probably, there were never an idea that this would become a country or a colony or any of that. It was just an aid station. But you know, when people arrive and it's a beautiful country and they start moving into the hinterland behind the first ranges of mountains, and they see what the prospects of settling into that country were, they started settling. So one could call them the settlers or whatever you want to call them. These were Dutch descendants, speaking Dutch of those years. And that is where my language comes from. Afrikaans is a derivative of Dutch with a few German words and maybe other words as well, but it is basically from that history. South Africa became a British colony in 1802. Which means now the legislature and government in Cape Town became English speaking, but all the people in the hinterland were Dutch speaking. So of course that was the raison for conflict. by saying that this was now, that the Dutch settlers moved into this hinterland doesn't mean that that was unoccupied. There were thousands of people living there, and that is the indigenous people, or the native people of South Africa. Now, very early on, race and mixture then became a part of the history of South Africa. Now, I'm trying not to give this lecture, I'm trying to explain your question. So, I think, now fast forward, because we're talking about a 400-year history, or a 350-year history. So at some point, these Afrikaner people, or Dutch descendants, they kind of like stood together and formed a nation. Now, they always say that it needs some kind of a traumatic event, like a war or something, to establish a nation. And I would say that the South African-English War of 1902 was probably that established the Afrikaner as a nation. So we are proud Afrikaners, and we are the white tribe of Africa. We cannot go back to Europe. We do not belong in Europe anymore. We are South African. It was very sad that in 1948, the National Party then became the leading party in the parliament, and that they instituted the policies of apartheid. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word. It means keeping people separate.
Reverend Sullivan, I think you may have answered this already, because I asked all my Methodist friends this. How did you become a Methodist? But you kind of answered that. You did because your family was. Is that correct? Or did you make a choice somewhere along the way to become a Methodist?
No, I was born in the Methodist church, but I think just to I was born into what I call a neutral Methodist church.
A what?
A neutral Methodist church. In South Africa, I mean, I think, I think we lived with the fallacy of, trying to be a Christian country. But, because of what happened with apartheid, it was really an embarrassment to God. And so there was a saying that went around that, politics and religion, don't mix. It's like oil and water. And so the church I grew up in kind of, embraced that. And so even though we lived in the township with, all the challenges, the discrimination, the deprivation, caused by, apartheid, the church, kind of, embraced, a pie in the sky, stance, and part of that was, just to figure out how do we survive this, how do we resist, while continuing to be able to care for family and all of that. And so, as part of the youth ministry, once we became more and more conscious of what was going on, once I realized that there are places that I cannot go to, such as Germiston, and Melbourne and other places, which were, for, whites only. We began to kind of ask some questions, not just of what was going on around us, but also about our faith. I mean, what is this, Christianity all about? In fact, I can clearly remember, asking myself, as a black person in South Africa, do I qualify to become a Christian? Because those who are oppressing us call themselves Christian. So if that's the religion that I need to become a part of, then, maybe I should look for other, religions and faith traditions to be a part of. So my identity crisis as an adolescent was not just about what happened, was not transition from puberty to, to adulthood, it was also a very deep sense of struggling with my dignity, struggling with my sense of worth, because I'm living in a country, that through its constitution has decided to define me based on the color of my skin. So that was a very, very, challenging time. And so as I, became more and more involved in where the church was standing nationally as a denomination, I found that there was a gap between what we were doing locally and where the church stood nationally. And so as I read more and asked more and more questions, I realized that the Methodist Church was one of the denominations at the forefront of resisting and fighting apartheid and seeking to facilitate, a free South Africa for all. And that moved me, from just being, a neutral, being part of a neutral faith community, to becoming part of a progressive and a prophetic, youth community within the church that really, began to see how do we practice our faith in such a way that it facilitates, a freedom, so that we can experience what God is calling us to experience, while we are on earth, and don't have to wait, to die to experience, heaven and all of that. Why isn't it that we can, work for that, that community right here, right now? So then, I transitioned then from just, being part of a faith community who have chosen not to, necessarily deal with it, to one, who was at the forefront, of resisting and looking at how one's faith, can be utilized, for freedom, and for democracy in South Africa. I characterize it, by saying that the more questions I asked, it drew me deeper into the essentials of what it means, to be a person of faith in general, but especially, a person of faith from the Christian, perspective around that. And I will never forget the, phrase that helped me with that was, as I grew more and more, into my faith, then began to say that how can we use this tool called religion and this tool called faith, used as a justification, for racial oppression, as the tool now for the liberation of everyone. And so that was my journey of transitioning, into my faith, and that what continues to guide me right now as I continue to do what I do.
Thank you.
You've heard this business about apartheid and separateness and all that. I want to bring it kind of down to the point where you understand that everything about South Africa was racial. You could not even have, as white people, you couldn't have black people to your house for dinner because that was illegal. I had some cousins, very distant cousins, who I think were members of the Communist Party. I'm not absolutely clear, but they liked to have interracial dinners at their house in Johannesburg. And they were warned several times that this was illegal and not to do it. One particular night, in the middle of the night, the police showed up, broke in their front door, and arrested the wife and the husband and took them away. They left two children, 4 years old and 2 years old, on their own. They weren't discovered until the next morning, and it took 6 weeks to find where the parents were being held. There was no such thing as habeas corpus. They were questioned and finally released, but they were held under house arrest for the next 2 years. This is a very dramatic, I mean, you see pictures like Selma and talk about the issues in the South, but you don't realize that people couldn't even get married in South Africa unless they had the right racial qualifications. Everybody carried pass cards, and the pass cards identified your race. And if you just had a relative that was 1/8 black or Indian or whatever, you were classified according to that demographic. This is a very hostile environment. And even for people such as my family that were opposed to apartheid, it was dangerous to be opposing the government in those days.
Thank you. We are celebrating the anniversary of the release of Nelson Mandela.
I think for me, my experience of migration to South Africa, to the United States, is one that I basically became acquainted with through the experience of African Americans in this country. And while, in East Tennessee, I became the president of the International Student Association on campus. And that afforded me the privilege of getting to know and understand migration stories of some of my fellow students from Costa Rica, from Bolivia, as well as from Yemen, from Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. And so, early on, I started realizing the challenges that some of them were facing. Even though we were students on campus and had student visas for the first, 3 years, that's what we, basically became acquainted with, because our lives revolved around what was happening on campus. But I say that I experienced it through the eyes of the African American experience here, because as a black immigrant, part of the experience here is dealing with the ongoing challenges of the jour discrimination here in the United States. And so when we were out with some buddies one night, and the sheriff stopped us in coming back, to the college. The sheriff stopped us, and we had to now decide, okay, what are we going to do about this? And so I said to them, don't worry, guys, I'm from South Africa, so I can hopefully see if I can, use the fact that I'm not from the United States as a way to get us out of this. And so I made the first mistake, which was to get out of the car, to see if I can talk with the sheriff's deputy. And as I approached him, and of course he said, well, why are you getting out of the car? I said, well, I just wanted to find out what we are being stopped for. And by the way, I just wanted to let you know that I was, born and raised in South Africa, and so it's good to be here. And I just wanted to let you know if we made any mistakes, it's probably my error, because we drive on the other side of the road, and I kind of came up with all kinds of excuses. And then he said these words with me. He said, "Oh, so you are just a nigger with an accent." I then realized the racial challenges continuing in South Africa, and that very phrase in South Africa is keffe. And for about 10 seconds, I was transported back to South Africa, and realized that something else is going on here that I need to acquaint myself with in terms of what needs to happen here in the United States. And so that, of course, began to deepen our conversations with some of our students from around the world, for them to begin to understand that the lives we live here is not the same as, where we're coming from. And we have to get to know and understand, what is happening with people of color in this country, and to begin to understand and know their story, because it will give us insight into how it is that we need to be present here in the United States of America.
So I came here, on a whim. I actually came in the early 1990s, so it was just after Mandela was released. South Africa was changing. I'm finishing my PhD. I did my PhD in England, in Cambridge, and I was sort of finishing it and deciding what to do next. My assumption always had been I'd go back to South Africa. They need newly minted PhDs there, and I'm going to definitely go back. And then on a whim, because at this time I had my son had already been born, and on a whim I said, well, let me just wait a bit and go, and I just applied for a fellowship to the US, to Yale, and I got it. And I thought, oh, we'll just go for a year, and that was it. We've stayed on ever since, because just one thing led to another, and I stayed on. But I do go back to South Africa almost every year because my family lives in Cape Town. But one of the things that I did notice, and it just occurred to me while we were talking, is that the way in which racism and apartheid was racism, and another word for it was racism, the way in which it worked was that it compartmentalized people in an incredibly dramatic and drastic way. So people were separated forcibly. And what the opposition movements did in the country was to actually attack that somehow. So they made an effort to engage in opposition across, different different classes, different geographical areas, different races, and so on. And that's what made the opposition movement so powerful. And one of the things I noticed even in the US is that there is, even though it's much more, it's obviously much more of a melting pot in some ways, I guess, it is also compartmentalized. And that's something that, just occurs to me because it's such a drastic comparison to South Africa. But there is a degree to which people here too compartmentalize themselves. In places they live in with the friends they have, with the places they go to, places they eat at, and so on. So there's a level at which it still exists, and I think that was what the opposition movements in South Africa fought against. And I think in some ways that's what pushed the revolution forward.
President Mandela say in his speech, he wasn't in favor of white domination and he wasn't in favor of black domination. And I'd like to ask our panelists, California, let's talk about California. California is changing dramatically, demographically. I go to a lot of meetings in the community. I'm Mexican American. And quite frankly, I don't like what I hear about, boy, it's going to be our turn to be in control. They don't say it like that, my Latino brothers and sisters, but that's kind of what I'm hearing. Now that we control, there's this thing about immigrants. Once you are a U.S. citizen, now you forget your roots, you forget your struggles, and suddenly you want to kind of push down on the people who are following. And that's kind of a little bit of what I'm not saying it's completely that way, but it's troublesome to me that we live in a multicultural society. And I guess my question to you is based on your abundance of experience now in these two countries, is how do we manage to create a truly multicultural place for all of us to live? Power is always the source of problems here, and the economics that we live with. California has a tremendous opportunity, seems to me, to be able to create a new humanity among us in many, many ways. And so I'm kind of interested in all that you've had to say has been enormously enriching. But what would you say to us now that you've lived in this country and based on your past experience, what kind of things do you think we need to look at to try to create the kind of society we all want? Who wants to start? I saw you grab the microphone. Go ahead.
Yeah, in preparation for this, I, spent some time listening, to, not just President Mandela's speech that he made in 1990, but also the speech that he made when he was sentenced, even before I was born, just to kind of get a sense of it. And then, in looking at it, try to, figure out where I am right now, in this work, this intersection for me of, the unfinished agenda of the civil rights movement and the agenda in the immigrant rights movement, and even with that, dealing with the fact that within the immigrant rights movement there are still some people rendered invisible because of their, race and because of the color of their skin. In terms of, and that is, that sense of paternalism, is even present within, the civil rights movement and, within the civil rights movement, and was always fascinated by, that phrase, around white-black domination. I read that and I interpret that, to him saying, that supremacy cannot and will not work anyway. And that he was actually, opposed to any sense, any manifestation of supremacy. And we know this country, has been built, just like South Africa, was built on white supremacy. And that still continues, and that will determine, I believe, how, immigrants, will experience the United States, of America in terms of that. And so, so that phrase informs me, to realize, that racial discrimination, economic exploitation, social marginalization, as well as cultural, discrimination. And apartheid was all of that. Apartheid was not just an ideology or a theology about racial oppression. Apartheid was also about cultural, subjugation. It was also about economic exploitation. And I think in looking at it, he was addressing all of that supremacy in all of its forms, whether it's racial, whether it's cultural, whether it's economic, or whether it is in any manifestation, is not going to work. And so he says that in the speech, that apartheid has no future. Having been in this country now and have seen the manifestations of versions of apartheid, not just in the US, but elsewhere, I believe that the 25th anniversary of his release is saying to us that we have to be careful not to allow any vestiges or new emergence of apartheid or to take place, because it has no future. It has no future in the United States. It has no future in South Africa, because supremacy, is, a way of violating a person's humanity, devaluing a person's dignity, as we move forward. So that's how it informs me, as I deal with, what's going on, not just in the United States, but what continues to go on in South Africa. After all, in South Africa, we have only dealt with the political dispensation. We have about 2 or 3 revolutions to deal with in South Africa, and we must hasten to get there, lest we realize that the most liberal constitution in the United States is actually at risk until we deal with the economic system and the cultural pieces in South Africa as we move forward. So that's what I get, from him and the speech. It's really, once again, a reminder of the work that has to be done and an urgent call to action.
Just one comment, just to add to that, is that in South Africa, one of the things that happened that was really a phenomenal institution was that during the transition, there was what was called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what it did was that it allowed the country to transition in that people had to take some degree of responsibility for what they had done under apartheid. And this applied to everyone because it wasn't just a political system, it was regular people treating other folks in these oppressive ways. So that was something, I think, is a bit of a milestone in that it was this moment when the whole country begins to recognize some of the atrocities that were committed in the past, and it's almost a passage to a new South Africa. Given that, it's obvious that if you visit South Africa, there's still a long way to go, just in terms of cultural oppression, economic oppression, and so on. But what we have then, what it teaches us is, and I just want to reiterate what you said, because what it teaches us is that even though you might have one of the most enlightened and progressive constitutions in the world, and it does have that, it still has such a long way to go in terms of all of the other levels of inequality and oppression that exist in the country then under apartheid and today in the post-apartheid system. And I guess, that's what we're talking about in the US as well, that we have this fairly enlightened constitution that constantly needs to be pushed further, and people need to debate the implications of that on an everyday basis, on the way in which it affects us economically, socially, and culturally, as well as politically. So there are, I don't have any answers, but there are similarities.
Unfortunately, we seem to be going in the other direction in this country. Because if you just take a look at the Supreme Court, their rulings have rolled back the clock significantly on all of the issues, cultural, economic, political, that all of us hoped was solved many years ago. And I just look at one area that I find really disturbing, and that is public education. Because my wife and I were part of a group in an area that we live in West LA, where we actually developed a paired school program between two schools, one black and one predominantly white, developed a really enriching cultural experience for those kids who lived like half a mile away from each other, but didn't know each other. And that was the days when people were concerned about things like busing. Busing was not acceptable. Today, I think we have a more segregated school system in Los Angeles than we ever had in the 60s when our kids were in school there. It has gone in the reverse direction. And my hope is this, that the demographics are such that the immigration system, regardless of what the Republicans try to do with it, is going to allow more and more Hispanics and Latinos to have a place in the society to vote and to count their involvement in the process. And one would hope that with those kinds of minorities and, or now majorities, working together perhaps, not competing, that we will see some real changes. But I have to say that currently I'm somewhat discouraged about the situation in the United States.
I probably have a little word of caution or a bit of a warning that I would like to give to us in this room tonight. And that is that, and you alluded to that, we have to be very, very careful that the oppressed don't become the next oppressor. That is exactly what happened during apartheid. During the South African War, or we call it the Anglo-Boer War, that was fought between the two Boer republics. There were two little small areas, the Transvaal and the Free State. Those were little republics. And they were fighting the British Empire, or the Brits came, whatever the historical reason is, that was a war. Everybody suffered. The white Afrikaners, they lost the war. They lost their dignity. And after that, it was the biggest thing in their lives was to regain their dignity, was to form an identity, as opposed to the English who were the oppressor at the time. I'm talking 1902 to 1940. So by the time 1940 came around and the Afrikaner then established itself, it was a huge they were very proud. It was a national or patriotic movement that got the National Party into power in 1948. Unfortunately, they did not learn any lessons from the past, but they became the next oppressor. That is why I really have so much reverence for the work of Steve Biko. Because Steve Biko was, in my mind, one of the people, and he lived in the 70s, because the oppressor then tells the oppressed, you are worth nothing, you have no value. That's the narrative. And he was the one that stood up and said, no, I am, as a human being, have value. And he formed the Black Consciousness Movement. And at the time, now of course at the time, Mr. Mandela was in jail, so we didn't even know about it. But Steve Biko was the one, and you probably could tell much more about that history and the work that Biko did. Giving the black people of South Africa an understanding of what it is to be worthy, a worthy human being. And I think for us in this country, where we have, now this situation of course is so much more complex. There are so many more different immigration groups. I live in Glendale, and in Glendale there's a large Armenian community, there's a large Korean community, etc., etc. And I can see that is also happening there, that some of these ethnic groups, or the risk is that some of these ethnic groups start forming their coalitions to take over. Now, it's maybe a good thing to improve your schools and your streets and all of that, but to move over from the oppressed to the new oppressor, that is a word of caution that I would like to put on the table and warn ourselves, to take notice of that.
Thank you. We'd like to, what kind of things do you think we need to look at to try to create the kind of society we all want? Who wants to start? I saw you grab the microphone. Go ahead.
Yeah, in preparation for this, I, spent some time listening, to, not just President Mandela's speech that he made in 1990, but also the speech that he made when he was sentenced, even before I was born, just to kind of get a sense of it. And then, in looking at it, try to, figure out where I am right now, in this work, this intersection for me of, the unfinished agenda of the civil rights movement and the agenda in the immigrant rights movement, and even with that, dealing with the fact that within the immigrant rights movement there are still some people rendered invisible because of their, race and because of the color of their skin. In terms of, and that is, that sense of paternalism, is even present within, the civil rights movement and, within the civil rights movement, and was always fascinated by, that phrase, around white-black domination. I read that and I interpret that, to him saying, that supremacy cannot and will not work anyway. That he was actually, opposed to any sense, any manifestation of supremacy. And we know this country, has been built, just like South Africa, was built on white supremacy. And that still continues, and that will determine, I believe, how, immigrants, will experience the United States, of America in terms of that. And so, that phrase informs me, to realize, that racial discrimination, economic exploitation, social marginalization, as well as cultural, discrimination. And apartheid was all of that. Apartheid was not just an ideology or a theology about racial oppression. Apartheid was also about cultural, subjugation. It was also about economic exploitation. And I think in looking at it, he was addressing all of that. That supremacy in all of its forms, whether it's racial, whether it's cultural, whether it's economic, or whether it is in any manifestation, is not going to work. And so he says that in the speech, that apartheid has no future. Having been in this country now and have seen the manifestations of versions of apartheid, not just in the US, but elsewhere, I believe that the 25th anniversary of his release is saying to us that we have to be careful not to allow any vestiges or new emergence of apartheid or to take place, because it has no future. It has no future in the United States. It has no future in South Africa, because supremacy, is, a way of violating a person's humanity, devaluing a person's dignity, as we move forward. So that's how it informs me, as I deal with, what's going on, not just in the United States, but what continues to go on in South Africa. After all, in South Africa, we have only dealt with the political dispensation. We have about 2 or 3 revolutions to deal with in South Africa, and we must hasten to get there, lest we realize that the most liberal constitution in the United States is actually at risk until we deal with the economic system and the cultural, pieces in South Africa as we move forward. So that's what I get, from him and the speech. It's really, once again, a reminder of the work that has to be done and an urgent call to action.
Just one comment, just to add to that, is that in South Africa, one of the things that happened that was really a phenomenal institution was that during the transition, there was what was called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what it did was that it allowed the country to transition in that people had to take some degree of responsibility for what they had done under apartheid. And this applied to everyone, because it wasn't just a political system, it was regular people treating other folks in these oppressive ways. So that was something, I think, is a bit of a milestone, in that it was this moment when the whole country begins to recognize some of the atrocities that were committed in the past, and it's almost a passage to a new South Africa. Given that, it's obvious that if you visit South Africa, there's still a long way to go, just in terms of cultural oppression, economic oppression, and so on. But what we have then, what it teaches us is, and I just want to reiterate what he said, because what it teaches us is that even though you might have one of the most enlightened and progressive constitutions in the world, and it does have that, it still has such a long way to go in terms of all of the other levels of inequality and oppression that exist in the country then under apartheid and today in the post-apartheid system. And I guess, that's what we're talking about in the US as well. That we have this fairly enlightened constitution that constantly needs to be pushed further, and people need to debate the implications of that on an everyday basis, on the way in which it affects us economically, socially, and culturally, as well as politically. So there are, I don't have any answers, but there are similarities.
Unfortunately, we seem to be going in the other direction in this country. Because if you just take a look at the Supreme Court, their rulings have rolled back the clock significantly on all of the issues, cultural, economic, political, that all of us hoped was solved many years ago. And I just look at one area that I find really disturbing, and that is public education. Because my wife and I were part of a group in an area that we live in West LA, where we actually developed a paired school program between two schools, one black and one predominantly white, developed a really enriching cultural experience for those kids who lived like half a mile away from each other, but didn't know each other. And that was the days when people were concerned about things like busing. Busing was not acceptable. Today, I think we have a more segregated school system in Los Angeles than we ever had in the 60s when our kids were in school there. It has gone in the reverse direction. And my hope is this, that the demographics are such that the immigration system, regardless of what the Republicans try to do with it, is going to allow more and more Hispanics and Latinos to have a place in the society to vote and to count their involvement in the process. And one would hope that with those kinds of minorities and, or now majorities, working together perhaps, not competing, that we will see some real changes. But I have to say that currently I'm somewhat discouraged about the situation in the United States.
Mandela was released from prison. He came to New York to take part in an ecumenical interfaith service at Riverside Church in New York, where I happened to be living at the time. I was a member of Riverside Church, and I was working in New York with the UCC Global Ministries. And the people who were putting together that worship service needed somebody to read the scriptures in Spanish. Please, may it be me, may it be me. And it was. So I got to participate in that service, which was one of the high points of being in New York. But what I wanted to share was, before the service, the participants were in the chapel. Riverside Church is huge. It seats 2,000. It's a UCC Baptist church. And the participants were in the chapel. In walks Nelson Mandela. And he came to personally thank each and every one of us for participating in that service. That still gives me chills because, to have an opportunity to meet him, but he was so gracious and so humble and so relaxed. And he came to thank the religious community for their support, for the boycotts that they had put in place, and he personally wanted to thank us for that effort. That was a very special moment. At the conclusion of the service, which was a magnificent service, I will never forget him dancing in the aisles during the benediction in the South African style of celebration. So I just wanted to share that with you because it was certainly and always has been a high point of my life. I didn't have any high points in New York. That place is too cold. Anyway, I want to thank this great group of panelists. It's been a privilege to sit with you folks and to hear your stories. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. So let's hear it for